The joke landed before the sun did. It slipped out of a veteran's mouth, light and careless, but it spread fast, carried on the dry wind that scraped skin raw. "Only 17, seriously." The words floated across the firing line and settled on the boy's shoulders like dust that would not brush off. He stood there anyway, boots half a size too big sinking into sand still cool from night. A rifle heavier than his frame suggested he could manage. The desert watched with its ancient indifference, heat already coiling for the day, waiting to see who would break first. No one had explained why he was here. Explanations were for men who belonged. He had arrived with a paper trail, so thin it felt insulting. A body too young for the history stitched into the uniforms around him. These were men who had buried friends and learned to keep their faces still when names were spoken. They looked at him now with something between amusement and offense, as if youth itself were a provocation. The boy felt it all, the eyes, the judgment, the unspoken dare, but inside him there was a quiet that had been earned the hard way. The trial was already underway, steel targets rising and falling in the distance, shimmering in heat that bent the world. Chalk scraped against a board as scores were marked, wiped, corrected. Efficiency ruled here. There was no room for excuses, and certainly no patience for a teenager pretending at adulthood. When the SEALs fired, they did so with the calm violence of men who trusted their bodies to remember what their minds no longer needed to command. Hits rang out, clean and authoritative. Someone laughed again, softer this time, confident the story had already written itself. The boy waited. He did not shift his weight or glance at the board. He felt the rifle's warmth through his gloves, smelled oil and dust and the faint metallic tang of anticipation. Waiting was something he understood. He had learned early that silence could be a weapon, that stillness could hold more power than speed. In the quiet space behind his eyes, he counted breaths, letting his pulse settle until it felt like someone else's heartbeat. When his name was finally called, it was said without ceremony, almost as an afterthought. He stepped forward, the laughter thinning into a watchful hush. He did not look at the men behind him. He looked through the scope, into a world narrowed to reticle and mirage. Wind brushed his cheek, teasing, testing. He adjusted without thinking, muscles responding to lessons learned alone, far from approval. The first shot broke the air and disappeared into heat. Steel rang, a pause followed, long enough to be intentional. Another shot, another clear hit. He did not rush to prove anything. Each breath was placed carefully, like a footstep across thin ice. By the third target, something had changed. The desert felt closer, as if it were leaning in, curious now. Numbers were written, erased, written again. No one laughed. The boy remained where he was, face calm, though inside a tightness loosened, just enough to remind him he was human. He knew this was only the beginning. Respect, once stirred, often turned sharp, and in this place being noticed could be as dangerous as being dismissed. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last excuses of the morning. The trial moved on, distances stretching, angles shifting, pressure building without a word spoken. The boy settled back into stillness, aware that every eye now followed him, not with humor, but with calculation. He felt the weight of it and accepted it. This was the cost of stepping forward. This was the price of silence broken by results. The desert learned his name without ever hearing it spoken. By midday, heat pressed down hard enough to make the horizon tremble, turning distance into a living thing that lied to the eyes. Sweat traced slow lines down the boy's spine beneath the borrowed gear, but his hands stayed steady. The laughter from earlier had died completely, replaced by something heavier, an alert silence that followed his movements like a shadow. He felt it in the way men no longer looked away when he stepped forward, in the way conversation stopped mid-breath. The next phase was designed to bruise confidence. Targets appeared where the light bent worst half, hidden by mirage and wind that shifted just enough to punish certainty. The SEALs adapted as they always did, adjusting stances, reading the air with instincts sharpened over years. Their shots were efficient, disciplined, undeniable. No one questioned their skill. What unsettled them was not being outmatched, but being followed closely by someone who had no business keeping pace. The boy watched without resentment. He studied the way shoulders tightened after a miss, how jaws set when numbers were called out. He recognized the emotion beneath it, because he had lived with it privately for years. The fear of slipping, of being measured and found wanting. When his turn came, he did not rush to answer it. He let the fear pass through him like heat through metal, leaving strength behind. He fired, paused, fired again. Each shot was placed with care that bordered on tenderness. The rifle kicked and settled, as if it trusted him to bring it home each time. Hits stacked quietly. The chalkboard changed in small, undeniable ways. A gap opened, then widened. Someone cleared their throat. Another man frowned at the board as if it were lying. The wind shifted, sharp and mischievous. A target swung late, testing reflex over patience. The boy waited a fraction longer than felt comfortable, then fired. The steel rang in that sound, something old cracked. It was not anger that moved through the line, but disbelief edged with pride wounded deep enough to sting. These men were used to being the standard. Now the standard was standing in front of them, too young, too calm. He felt the weight of it, then the unspoken accusation that his presence somehow diminished theirs. The boy carried it without complaint. He knew skill did not steal from others. It only revealed what already existed. Still, he understood the resentment blooming in the silence. Excellence, especially when unexpected, had a way of making enemies before it made allies. As the trial wore on, fatigue crept in like a slow tide. Muscles ached, eyes burned, mistakes appeared, small but costly. The boy felt his own limits approaching and welcomed the warning. He adjusted, conserving energy, trusting precision over force. He thought of long nights practicing alone, of learning to listen to his body when no one else would. Those lessons paid their debt now. By late afternoon, the numbers were no longer close. The realization moved through the group without words. Triple, the count hovered in the air, too large to ignore. A senior operator finally looked at the boy not as an anomaly, but as a problem that demanded understanding. The boy met his gaze briefly, then looked away, unwilling to turn victory into provocation. The desert cooled slightly as the sun tilted west, shadows stretching thin and long. The trial was not finished. Everyone knew it. What remained would decide not just skill, but character. The boy inhaled, slow and deep, aware that the hardest part was still ahead, not the shooting, but what came after, when silence would demand more than accuracy. The final phase was introduced without ceremony, as if dignity itself were being rationed. There were no speeches, no encouragement, only a subtle tightening in posture among the men who understood what this stage was meant to do. It was designed to expose flaws that numbers could hide. Movement replaced stillness. Time pressed closer. The desert, cooling at last, carried the smell of hot metal and dust disturbed too often in one day. The boy felt the shift immediately. This was no longer about precision alone. It was about judgment under strain. Targets would not wait. Decisions would not forgive hesitation. He watched the SEALs move through the scenario first, their bodies remembering patterns carved by experience. They were fast, aggressive, decisive. Even when mistakes came, they were owned and corrected without panic. These were professionals at the edge of exhaustion, and it showed in the way they kept going anyway. As he waited, the boy felt something unfamiliar surface beneath his calm. Not fear, but doubt. Not about his skill, but about his place. He wondered briefly if winning here would cost him more than losing ever could. The thought passed as quickly as it came. He had learned that asking permission from the future was a waste of breath. All that mattered was the moment he was about to enter. When he stepped forward, the air felt thinner. The silence behind him was absolute now. heavy with expectation and resistance alike. The first target broke into motion, cutting across his field of view at an angle meant to lure speed over sense. He let it move. The second appeared almost immediately, closer, louder in its demand. He chose the order that felt wrong to anyone watching and trusted the math only he could see. 2 shots, 2 clean hits. A third target popped late, far, cruelly distant. He adjusted, fired, and felt the rifle settle like a living thing agreeing with his choice. Breath shortened, muscles burned, sweat stung his eyes, blurring the edges of the world. He did not wipe it away. He had trained through worse, through nights when fatigue became a voice telling him to stop. He let that voice speak and then ignored it. The sequence pushed on, unforgiving. He moved, fired, paused, corrected. Not once did he rush to reclaim time. He let time bend around him instead. A miss echoed from somewhere behind him, a sharp reminder that even legends falter. The boy felt the ripple it sent through the line. Pressure shifted, invisible but undeniable. He carried it forward, knowing it was not his to bear, yet unwilling to let it go to waste. When the final target emerged, low and fast, he waited a breath longer than instinct begged him to. The shot landed true. The ring of steel lingered, stretching the moment open. When it was over, no one spoke. The tally was updated once, carefully, as if rough handling might change the result. The gap was no longer a question. It was a fact. The boy lowered the rifle slowly, aware of a tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with fear. He had crossed something irreversible. Numbers could be rewritten, but impressions could not. A senior man stepped closer, his presence heavy with history. He did not offer praise or challenge. He simply looked at the boy as if seeing him for the first time, measuring not his score, but his restraint. In that look, the boy understood the true test had never been the targets. It had been whether he could stand at the center of disbelief and remain himself. The desert answered with silence, and in that silence, the boy waited for whatever judgment would come next. The judgment came without announcement. It arrived in the way the men stood afterward, not dispersing as they usually did, not filling the space with analysis or bravado. Helmets were set down carefully. Gloves were pulled off and folded. The desert exhaled as the sun slipped lower, cooling the ground beneath their boots, leaving behind a quiet that felt deliberate. This was not celebration. It was recognition, heavier and harder to earn. The boy remained where he was, rifle grounded, posture unchanged. He did not search faces for approval. He had learned that respect when real moved slowly. A senior operator finally stepped forward, his shadow long and steady. Years lived hard were written into the lines around his eyes. He looked at the chalkboard once more, then at the boy, as if confirming that numbers alone could not explain what had happened here. No words were offered at first. The silence stretched, not awkward, but intentional. In it, the boy felt the last of his tension drain away, replaced by something quieter, acceptance, perhaps, or relief stripped of triumph. He understood now that the jeer from the morning had not been cruelty for its own sake. It had been a gate, crude and unforgiving, placed in front of anyone who dared to step beyond expectation. When the senior man finally spoke, it was not to ask his age again. That question no longer mattered. What mattered was how he had carried himself when dismissed, how he had chosen restraint over retaliation, precision over spectacle. The words were brief, professional, almost understated. An acknowledgement, not a coronation. An opening, not a promise. The others followed in their own ways. A nod held a second longer than necessary, a look that no longer slid past him. Respect did not arrive all at once, but it arrived honestly. The boy accepted it the same way he had accepted the heat and the pressure, with composure. He knew better than to mistake this moment for an ending. It was only a line crossed. As the desert darkened, the trial dissolved back into routine. Gear was loaded. Tracks were erased by wind. The boy sat briefly on the tailgate of a truck, hands resting on his knees, feeling the ache in his body now that he allowed himself to notice it. 17 still clung to him as a fact of time. but it no longer defined the space he occupied. He had learned something enduring here, that silence could answer mockery better than words, that excellence needed no defense. When he finally stood to leave, the desert had already reclaimed the field. Nothing marked where the counts had been tallied, where disbelief had turned into something harder and truer. The boy walked away without looking back, carrying no trophy, no applause, only the knowledge that on this ground, under this sky, he had been measured honestly. And that was enough.